Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to The Secret of Chimneys by Agatha Christie. This book is divided in 4 videos. This is part 4. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 22. The Red Signal. Superintendent Battle was standing in the library at Wyvern Abbey. George Lomax, seated before a desk overflowing with papers, was frowning portentously. Superintendent Battle had opened proceedings by making a brief and businesslike report. Since then, the conversation had lain almost entirely with George, and Battle had contented himself with making brief and usually monosyllabic replies to the other's questions. On the desk, in front of George, was the packet of letters Anthony had found on his dressing table. "I can't understand it at all," said George irritably, as he picked up the packet. "They're in code, you say?" "Just so, Mr. Lomax." "And where does he say he found them?" "On his dressing table." Battle repeated, word for word, Anthony Cade's account of how he had come to regain possession of the letters. "And he brought them at once to you. That was quite proper. Quite proper. But who could have placed them in his room?" Battle shook his head. "That's the sort of thing you ought to know," complained George. "It sounds to me very fishy. Very fishy indeed. What do we know about this man Cade, anyway? He appears in a most mysterious manner, under highly suspicious circumstances, and we know nothing whatever about him. I may say that I, personally, don't care for his manner at all. You've made inquiries about him, I suppose." Superintendent Battle permitted himself a patient smile. "We wired at once to South Africa, and his story has been confirmed on all points. He was in Bulawayo with Mr. McGrath at the time he stated. Previous to their meeting, he was employed by Messrs. Castle, the tourist agents." "Just what I should have expected," said George. "He has the kind of cheap assurance that succeeds in a certain type of employment. But about these letters, steps must be taken at once. At once." The great man puffed himself out and swelled importantly. Superintendent Battle opened his mouth, but George forestalled him. "There must be no delay. These letters must be decoded without any loss of time. Let me see, who is the man? There is a man. Connected with the British Museum. Knows all there is to know about ciphers. Ran the department for us during the war. Where is Miss Oscar? She will know. Name something like Win. "Professor Winwood," said Battle. "Exactly. I remember perfectly now. He must be wired to immediately. I have done so, Mr. Lomax, an hour ago. He will arrive by the 12.10. "Oh, very good, very good. Thank heaven something is off my mind. I shall have to be in town today. You can get along without me, I suppose?" "I think so, sir." "Well, do your best, Battle. Do your best. I am terribly rushed just at present." "Just so, sir. By the way, why did not Mr. Eversley come over with you?" "He was still asleep, sir. We've been up all night, as I told you." "Oh, quite so. I am frequently up nearly the whole night myself. To do the work of 36 hours in 24, that is my constant task. Send Mr. Eversley over at once when you get back, will you, Battle?" "I will give him your message, sir." "Thank you, Battle. I realise perfectly that you had to repose a certain amount of confidence in him. But do you think it was strictly necessary to take my cousin, Mrs. Revel, into your confidence also? In view of the names signed to those letters, I do, Mr. Lomax." "An amazing piece of effrontery," murmured George. His brow darkened as he looked at the bundle of letters. "I remember the late King of Herzegovina. A charming fellow, but weak. Deplorably weak. A tool in the hands of an unscrupulous woman. Have you any theory as to how these letters came to be restored to Mr. Cade?" "It's my opinion," said Battle, "that if people can't get a thing one way, they try another." "I don't quite follow you," said George. "This crook, this King Victor, He's well aware by now that the council chamber is watched, so he'll let us have the letters, and let us do the decoding, and let us find the hiding place, and then trouble. But Lemoyne and I between us will attend to that. You've got a plan, eh? I wouldn't go so far as to say I've got a plan, but I've got an idea. It's a very useful thing sometimes, an idea. Thereupon, Superintendent Battle took his departure. He had no intention of taking George any further into his confidence. On the way back, he passed Anthony on the road and stopped. "Going to give me a lift back to the house?" asked Anthony. "That's good. Where have you been, Mr. Cade?" "Down to the station to inquire about trains." Battle raised his eyebrows. "Thinking of leaving us again?" he inquired. "Not just at present," laughed Anthony. "By the way, what's upset Isaacstein? He arrived in the car just as I left, and he looked as though something had given him a nasty jolt." "Mr. Isaacstein?" "Yes." "I can't say I'm sure. I fancy it would take a good deal to jolt him." "So do I," agreed Anthony. "He's quite one of the strong, silent yellow men of finance." Suddenly, Battle leant forward and touched the chauffeur on the shoulder. "Stop, will you? And wait for me here." He jumped out of the car, much to Anthony's surprise, but in a minute or two the latter perceived Monsieur Lemoyne advancing to meet the English detective, and gathered that it was a signal from him which had attracted Battle's attention. There was a rapid colloquy between them, and then the superintendent returned to the car and jumped in again, bidding the chauffeur drive on. His expression had completely changed. "They've found the revolver," he said suddenly and curtly. "What?" Anthony gazed at him in great surprise. "Where?" "In Isaacstein's suitcase." "Oh, impossible." "Nothing's impossible," said Battle. "I ought to have remembered that." He sat perfectly still, tapping his knee with his hand. "Who found it?" Battle jerked his head over his shoulder. "Lemoyne. Clever chap. They think no end of him at the Sûreté." "But doesn't this upset all your ideas?" "No," said Superintendent Battle. Very slowly. "I can't say it does. It was a bit of a surprise, I admit, at first, but it fits in very well with one idea of mine." "Which is?" But the superintendent branched off onto a totally different subject. "I wonder if you'd mind finding Mr. Eversley for me, sir. There's a message for him from Mr. Lomax. He's to go over to the Abbey at once." "All right," said Anthony. The car had just drawn up at the great door. "He's probably in bed still." "I think not," said the detective. "If you'll look, you'll see him walking under the trees with Mrs. Revel." "Wonderful eyes you have, haven't you, Battle?" said Anthony as he departed on his errand. He delivered the message to Bill, who was duly disgusted. "Damn it all," grumbled Bill to himself as he strode off to the house. "Why can't codders sometimes leave me alone? And why can't these blasted colonials stay in their colonies? What do they want to come over here for? And pick out all the best girls? I'm fed to the teeth with everything." "Have you heard about the revolver?" asked Virginia breathlessly, as Bill left them. "Battle told me. Rather staggering, isn't it? Isaacstein was in a frightful state yesterday to get away, but I thought it was just nerves. He's about the one person I'd have pitched upon as being above suspicion. Can you see any motive for his wanting Prince Michael out of the way?" "It certainly doesn't fit in," agreed Virginia thoughtfully. "Nothing fits in anywhere," said Anthony discontentedly. "I rather fancied myself as an amateur detective to begin with, and so far all I've done is to clear the character of the French governess at vast trouble and some little expense." "Is that what you went to France for?" inquired Virginia. "Yes, I went to Dinard and had an interview with the Comtesse de Breteuil, awfully pleased with my own cleverness and fully expecting to be told that no such person as Mademoiselle Brun had ever been heard of, instead of which I was given to understand that the lady in question had been the mainstay of the household for the last 7 years. So unless the Comtesse is also a crook, that ingenious theory of mine falls to the ground. Virginia shook her head. Madame de Breteuil is quite above suspicion. I know her quite well, and I fancy I must have come across Mademoiselle at the chateau. I certainly know her face quite well. In that vague way one does know governesses and companions and people one sits opposite to in trains. It's awful, but I never really look at them properly. Do you? Only if they're exceptionally beautiful, admitted Anthony. Well, in this case, she broke off. What's the matter? Anthony was staring at a figure which detached itself from the clump of trees and stood there rigidly at attention. It was the Herzo-Slovakian, Boris. "Excuse me," said Anthony to Virginia. "I must just speak to my dog a minute." He went across to where Boris was standing. "What's the matter? What do you want?" "Master," said Boris, bowing. "Yes, that's all very well, but you mustn't keep following me about like this. It looks odd." Without a word, Boris produced a soiled scrap of paper, evidently torn from a letter, and handed it to Anthony. "What's this?" said Anthony. There was an address scrawled on the paper, nothing else. "He dropped it," said Boris. "I bring it to the master." "Who dropped it?" "The foreign gentleman." "But why bring it to me?" Boris looked at him reproachfully. "Well, anyway, go away now," said Anthony. "I'm busy." Boris saluted, turned sharply on his heel, and marched away. Anthony rejoined Virginia, thrusting the piece of paper into his pocket. "What did he want?" she asked curiously. "And why do you call him your dog?" "Because he acts like one," said Anthony, answering the last question first. "He must have been a retriever in his last incarnation, I think. He's just brought me a piece of a letter which he says the foreign gentleman dropped. I suppose he means Lemoyne." "I suppose so," acquiesced Virginia. "He's always following me round," continued Anthony, "just like a dog. Says next to nothing. Just looks at me with his big round eyes. I can't make him out." "Perhaps he meant Isaacstein," suggested Virginia. "Isaacstein looks foreign enough, heaven knows." "Isaacstein," muttered Anthony impatiently. "Where the devil does he come in?" "Are you ever sorry that you've mixed yourself up in all this?" asked Virginia suddenly. "Sorry? Good Lord, no, I love it. I've spent most of my life looking for trouble, you know. Perhaps this time I've got a little more than I bargained for." "But you're well out of the wood now," said Virginia, a little surprised by the unusual gravity of his tone. "Not quite." They strolled on for a minute or two in silence. "There are some people," said Anthony, breaking the silence, "who don't conform to the signals. An ordinary, well-regulated locomotive slows down or pulls up when it sees the red light hoisted against it. Perhaps I was born colour-blind. When I see the red signal, I can't help forging ahead. And in the end, you know, that spells disaster. Bound to. And quite right, really. That sort of thing is bad for traffic generally." He still spoke very seriously. "I suppose," said Virginia, "that you have taken a good many risks in your life." "Pretty nearly everyone there is, except marriage." "That's rather cynical. It wasn't meant to be. Marriage, the kind of marriage I mean, would be the biggest adventure of the lot." "I like that," said Virginia, flushing eagerly. "There's only one kind of woman I'd want to marry, the kind who is worlds removed from my type of life. What would we do about it? Is she to lead my life, or am I to lead hers? If she loved you— Sentimentality, Mrs. Revel, you know it is. Love isn't a drug that you take to blind you to your surroundings. You can make it that, yes, but it's a pity. Love can be a lot more than that. What do you think the king and his beggar maid thought of married life after they'd been married a year or two? Didn't she regret her rags and her bare feet and her carefree life? You bet she did. Would it have been any good renouncing his crown for her sake? Not a bit of good, either. He'd have made a damned bad beggar, I'm sure. And no woman respects a man when he's doing a thing thoroughly badly. Have you fallen in love with a beggar maid, Mr. Cade? Inquired Virginia softly. It's the other way about with me, but the principle's the same. And there's no way out? Asked Virginia. There's always a way out, said Anthony gloomily. I've a theory that one can always get anything one wants if one will pay the price. And do you know what the price is? 9 times out of 10. Compromise. A beastly thing. Compromise. But it steals upon you as you near middle age. It's stealing upon me now. To get the woman I want, I'd even take up regular work. Virginia laughed. I was brought up to a trade, you know, continued Anthony. And you abandoned it? Yes. Why? A matter of principle. Oh. You're a very unusual woman, said Anthony suddenly, turning and looking at her. Why? You can refrain from asking questions. You mean that I haven't asked you what your trade was? Just that. Again they walked on in silence. They were nearing the house now, passing close by the scented sweetness of the rose garden. You understand well enough, I dare say, said Anthony, breaking the silence. You know when a man's in love with you. I don't suppose you care a hang for me, or for anyone else, but by God, I'd like to make you care. Do you think you could? Asked Virginia in a low voice. Probably not, but I'd have a damn good try. Are you sorry you ever met me? She said suddenly. Lord, no, it's the red signal again. When I first saw you, that day in Pont Street, I knew I was up against something that was going to hurt like fun. Your face did that to me. Just your face. There's magic in you from head to foot. Some women are like that, but I've never known a woman who had so much of it as you have. You'll marry someone respectable and prosperous, I suppose, and I shall return to my disreputable life. But I'll kiss you once before I go, I swear I will. You can't do it now, said Virginia softly. Superintendent Battle is watching us out of the library window. Anthony looked at her. You're rather a devil, Virginia, he said dispassionately, but rather a dear too. Then he waved his hand airily to Superintendent Battle. Caught any criminals this morning, Battle? Not as yet, Mr. Cade. That sounds hopeful. Battle, with an agility surprising in so stolid a man, vaulted out of the library window and joined them on the terrace. I've got Professor Winwood down here, he announced in a whisper. Just this minute arrived. He's decoding the letters now. Would you like to see him at work? His tone suggested that of the showman speaking of some pet exhibit. Receiving a reply in the affirmative, he led them up to the window and invited them to peep inside. Seated at a table, the letters spread out in front of him and writing busily on a big sheet of paper was a small red-haired man of middle age. He grunted irritably to himself as he wrote, and every now and then rubbed his nose violently until its hue almost rivaled that of his hair. Presently he looked up. That you, Battle? What do you want me down here to unravel this tomfoolery for? A child in arms could do it. A baby of 2 could do it on its head. Call this thing a cipher. It leaps to the eye, man. I'm glad of that, Professor, said Battle mildly. But we're not all so clever as you are, you know. It doesn't need cleverness, snapped the Professor. It's routine work. Do you want the whole bundle done? It's a long business, you know. Requires diligent application and close attention, and absolutely no intelligence. I've done the one dated Chimneys which you said was important. I might as well take the rest back to London and hand 'em over to one of my assistants. I really can't afford the time myself. I've come away now from a real teaser, and I want to get back to it. His eyes glistened a little. Very well, Professor, assented Battle. I'm sorry we're such small fry. I'll explain to Mr. Lomax. It's just this one letter that all the hurry is about. Lord Caterham is expecting you to stay for lunch, I believe. Never have lunch, said the Professor. Bad habit. Lunch. A banana and a water biscuit is all any sane and healthy man should need in the middle of the day. He seized his overcoat, which lay across the back of a chair. Battle went round to the front of the house, and a few minutes later Anthony and Virginia heard the sound of a car driving away. Battle rejoined them, carrying in his hand the half-sheet of paper which the professor had given him. "He's always like that," said Battle, referring to the departed professor. "In the very deuce of a hurry. Clever man, though. Well, here's the kernel of Her Majesty's letter. Care to have a look at it?" Virginia stretched out a hand, and Anthony read it over her shoulder. It had been, he remembered, a long epistle, breathing mingled passion and despair. The genius of Professor Winwood had transformed it into an essentially businesslike communication. "Operations carried out successfully, but S. Double crossed us. Has removed stone from hiding place, not in his room. I have searched. Found following memorandum, which I think refers to it. Richmond, 7 straight 8, left 3, right." "S?" said Anthony. "Styleptitch, of course. Cunning old dog. He changed the hiding place." "Richmond," said Virginia thoughtfully. "Is the diamond concealed somewhere at Richmond, I wonder?" "It's a favourite spot for royalties," agreed Anthony. Battle shook his head. "I still think it's a reference to something in this house." "I know," cried Virginia suddenly. Both men turned to look at her. The Holbein portrait in the council chamber. They were tapping on the wall just below it. And it's a portrait of the Earl of Richmond. "You've got it," said Battle, and slapped his leg. He spoke with an animation quite unwanted. "That's the starting point, the picture, and the crooks know no more than we do what the figures refer to. Those two men in armour stand directly underneath the picture, and their first idea was that the diamond was hidden in one of them. The measurements might have been inches. That failed, and their next idea was a secret passage or stairway, or a sliding panel. Do you know of any such thing, Mrs. Revel?" Virginia shook her head. "There's a priest's hole, and at least one secret passage I know," she said. "I believe I've been shown them once, but I can't remember much about them now. Here's Bundle. She'll know." Bundle was coming quickly along the terrace towards them. "I'm taking the Panhard up to town after lunch," she remarked. "Anyone want a lift?" "Wouldn't you like to come, Mr. Cade? We'll be back by dinner time." "No, thanks," said Anthony. "I'm quite happy and busy down here." "The man fears me," said Bundle. "Either my driving or my fatal fascination. Which is it?" "The latter," said Anthony. "Every time." "Bundle, dear," said Virginia, "is there any secret passage leading out of the council chamber?" "Rather, but it's only a mouldy one. Supposed to lead from Chimneys to Wyvern Abbey. So it did in the old days, but it's all blocked up now. You can only get along it for about 100 yards from this end. The one upstairs in the White Gallery is ever so much more amusing, and the priest's hole isn't half bad." "We're not regarding them from an artistic standpoint," explained Virginia. "It's business. How do you get into the council chamber one?" "Hinged panel. I'll show you after lunch if you like." "Thank you," said Superintendent Battle. "Shall we say at 2.30? Bundle looked at him with lifted eyebrows. "Crook stuff?" she inquired. Treadwell appeared on the terrace. "Luncheon is served, my lady," he announced. Chapter 23. Encounter in the Rose Garden. At 2.30, a little party met together in the council chamber. Bundle, Virginia, Superintendent Battle, M. Lemoyne, and Anthony Cade. "No good waiting until we can get hold of Mr. Lomax," said Battle. "This is the kind of business one wants to get on with quickly." "If you've got any idea that Prince Michael was murdered by someone who got in this way, you're wrong," said Bundle. "It can't be done. The other end's blocked, completely." "There is no question of that, milady," said Lemoyne quickly. "It is quite a different search that we make." "Looking for something, are you?" asked Bundle quickly. "Not the historic whatnot, by any chance?" Lemoyne looked puzzled. "Explain yourself, Bundle," said Virginia encouragingly. You can when you try. The thingamy-bob, said Bundle. The historic diamond of purple princes that was pinched in the dark ages before I grew to years of discretion. Who told you this, Lady Eileen? Asked Battle. I've always known. One of the footmen told me when I was 12 years old. A footman, said Battle. Lord, I'd like Mr. Lomax to have heard that. Is it one of George's closely guarded secrets? Asked Bundle. How perfectly screaming. I never really thought it was true. George always was an ass. He must know that servants always know everything. She went across to the Holbein portrait, touched a spring concealed somewhere at the side of it, and immediately, with a creaking noise, a section of the panelling swung inward, revealing a dark opening. Entrez, messieurs et mesdames, said Bundle dramatically. Walk up, dearies. Best show of the season, and only a tanner. Both Lemoyne and Battle were provided with torches. They entered the dark aperture first, the others close on their heels. Air's nice and fresh, remarked Battle. Must be ventilated somehow. He walked on ahead. The floor was of rough, uneven stone, but the walls were bricked. As Bundle had said, the passage extended for a bare 100 yards. Then it came to an abrupt end with a fallen heap of masonry. Battle satisfied himself that there was no way of egress beyond, and then spoke over his shoulder. We'll go back, if you please. I wanted just to spy out the land, so to speak. In a few minutes they were back again at the panelled entrance. We'll start from here, said Battle. 7 straight, 8 left, 3 right. Take the first as paces. He paced 7 steps carefully, and bending down examined the ground. About right, I should fancy. At one time or another, there's been a chalk mark made here. Now then, 8 left. That's not paces. The passage is only wide enough to go Indian file anyway. Say it in bricks, suggested Anthony. Quite right, Mr. Cade. 8 bricks from the bottom or the top on the left-hand side. Try from the bottom first. It's easier. He counted up 8 bricks. Now 3 to the right of that. 1, 2, 3. Hullo. Hullo, what's this? I shall scream in a minute, said Bundle. I know I shall. What is it? Superintendent Battle was working at the brick with the point of his knife. His practised eye had quickly seen that this particular brick was different from the rest. A minute or two's work, and he was able to pull it right out. Behind was a small dark cavity. Battle thrust in his hand. Everyone waited in breathless expectancy. Battle drew out his hand again. He uttered an exclamation of surprise and anger. The others crowded round and stared uncomprehendingly at the 3 articles he held. For a moment it seemed as though their eyes must have deceived them. A card of small pearl buttons, a square of coarse knitting and a piece of paper on which were inscribed a row of capital E's. Well, said Battle, I'm dunged. What's the meaning of this? Mon Dieu, muttered the Frenchman. Car c'est un peu trop fort. But what does it mean? Cried Virginia, bewildered. Mean? Said Anthony. There's only one thing it can mean. The late Count Stilptich must have had a sense of humour. This is an example of that humour. I may say that I don't consider it particularly funny myself. Now, do you mind explaining your meaning a little more clearly, sir? Said Superintendent Battle. Certainly. This was the Count's little joke. He must have suspected that his memorandum had been read. When the crooks came to recover the jewel, they were to find instead this extremely clever conundrum. It's the sort of thing you pin on to yourself at book teas when people have to guess what you are. It has a meaning, then? I should say undoubtedly. If the Count had meant to be merely offensive, he would have put a placard with "sold" on it, or a picture of a donkey or something crude like that. A bit of knitting, some capital E's, and a lot of buttons, muttered Battle discontentedly. C'est inouï, said Lemoyne angrily. Cipher number 2, said Anthony. I wonder whether Professor Winwood would be any good at this one." "When was this passage last used, milady?" asked the Frenchman of Bundle. Bundle reflected. "I don't believe anyone's been into it for over 2 years. The Priest's Hole is the show exhibit for Americans and tourists generally." "Curious," murmured the Frenchman. "Why curious?" Lemoyne stooped and picked up a small object from the floor. "Because of this," he said. "This match has not lain here for 2 years, not even for 2 days." Battle looked at the match curiously. It was of pink wood, with a yellow head. "Any of you ladies or gentlemen drop this by any chance?" he asked. He received a negative all round. "Well then," said Superintendent Battle, "we've seen all there is to see. We might as well get out of here." The proposal was assented to by all. The panel had swung to, but Bundle showed them how it was fastened from the inside. She unlatched it, swung it noiselessly open, and sprang through the opening, alighting in the council chamber with a resounding thud. "Damn," said Lord Caterham, springing up from an armchair in which he appeared to have been taking 40 winks. "Poor old father," said Bundle. "Did I startle you?" "I can't think," said Lord Caterham, "why nobody nowadays ever sits still after a meal. It's a lost art. God knows Chimneys is big enough, but even here there doesn't seem to be a single room where I can be sure of a little peace. Good Lord, how many of you are there? Reminds me of the pantomimes I used to go to as a boy when hordes of demons used to pop up out of trapdoors." "Demon No. 7, said Virginia, approaching him and patting him on the head. "Don't be cross. We're just exploring secret passages, that's all." "There seems to be a positive boom in secret passages today," grumbled Lord Caterham, not yet completely mollified. "I've had to show that fellow Fish round them all this morning." "When was that?" asked Battle quickly. "Just before lunch. It seems he'd heard of the one in here. I showed him that, and then took him up to the White Gallery, and we finished up with the Priest's Hole. But his enthusiasm was waning by that time. He looked bored to death. But I made him go through with it." Lord Caterham chuckled at the remembrance. Anthony put a hand on Lemoyne's arm. "Come outside," he said softly. "I want to speak to you." The two men went out together through the window. When they had gone a sufficient distance from the house, Anthony drew from his pocket the scrap of paper that Boris had given him that morning. "Look here," he said. "Did you drop this?" Lemoyne took it and examined it with some interest. "No," he said. "I have never seen it before. Why?" "Quite sure." "Absolutely sure, monsieur." "That's very odd." He repeated to Lemoyne what Boris had said. The other listened with close attention. "No, I did not drop it. You say he found it in that clump of trees. Well, I assumed so, but he did not actually say so. It is just possible that it might have fluttered out of Monsieur Isaacstein's suitcase. Question Boris again." He handed the paper back to Anthony. After a minute or two, he said, "What exactly do you know of this man Boris?" Anthony shrugged his shoulders. "I understood he was the late Prince Michael's trusted servant." "It may be so, but make it your business to find out. Ask someone who knows, such as the Baron Lolopretschel. Perhaps this man was engaged but a few weeks ago. For myself, I have believed him honest. But who knows? King Victor is quite capable of making himself into a trusted servant at a moment's notice. Do you really think—" Lemoyne interrupted him. "I will be quite frank. With me, King Victor is an obsession. I see him everywhere. At this moment, even I ask myself, this man who is talking to me, this Monsieur Cade, is he perhaps King Victor?" "Good Lord," said Anthony, "you have got it badly." What do I care for the diamond? For the discovery of the murderer of Prince Michael? I leave those affairs to my colleague of Scotland Yard whose business it is. Me, I am in England for one purpose, and one purpose only, to capture King Victor, and to capture him red-handed. Nothing else matters. "Think you'll do it?" asked Anthony, lighting a cigarette. How should I know? Said Lemoyne with sudden despondency. Said Anthony. They had regained the terrace. Superintendent Battle was standing near the French window in a wooden attitude. Look at poor old Battle, said Anthony. Let's go and cheer him up. He paused a minute and said, You know, you're an odd fish in some ways, Monsieur Lemoyne. In what ways, Monsieur Cade? Well, said Anthony, in your place I should have been inclined to note down that address that I showed you. It may be of no importance, quite conceivably. On the other hand, it might be very important indeed. Lemoyne looked at him for a minute or two steadily. Then, with a slight smile, he drew back the cuff of his left coat sleeve. Pencilled on the white shirt cuff beneath were the words, Hurstmere, Langley Road, Dover. I apologise, said Anthony, and I retire worsted. He joined Superintendent Battle. You look very pensive, Battle, he remarked. I've got a lot to think about, Mr. Cade. Yes, I expect you have. Things aren't dovetailing. They're not dovetailing at all. Very trying, sympathised Anthony. Never mind, Battle. If the worst comes to the worst, you can always arrest me. You've got my guilty footprints to fall back upon, remember. But the superintendent did not smile. Got any enemies here that you know of, Mr. Cade? He asked. I've an idea that the third footman doesn't like me, replied Anthony lightly. He does his best to forget to hand me the choicest vegetables. Why? I've been getting anonymous letters, said Superintendent Battle. Or rather an anonymous letter, I should say. About me? Without answering, Battle took a folded sheet of cheap notepaper from his pocket and handed it to Anthony. Scrawled on it in an illiterate handwriting were the words, Look out for Mr. Cade. He isn't what he seems. Anthony handed it back with a light laugh. That's all. Cheer up, Battle. I'm really a king in disguise, you know. He went into the house, whistling lightly as he walked along. But as he entered his bedroom and shut the door behind him, his face changed. It grew set and stern. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared moodily at the floor. Things are getting serious, said Anthony to himself. Something must be done about it. It's all damned awkward. He sat there for a minute or two, then strolled to the window. For a moment or two he stood looking out aimlessly, and then his eyes became suddenly focused on a certain spot, and his face lightened. Of course, he said. The rose garden. That's it. The rose garden. He hurried downstairs again and out into the garden by a side door. He approached the rose garden by a circuitous route. It had a little gate at either end. He entered by the far one and walked up to the sundial which was on a raised hillock in the exact centre of the garden. Just as Anthony reached it, he stopped dead and stared at another occupant of the rose garden who seemed equally surprised to see him. I didn't know that you were interested in roses, Mr. Fish, said Anthony gently. Sir, said Mr. Fish, I am considerably interested in roses. They looked at each other warily, as antagonists seek to measure their opponent's strength. So am I, said Anthony. Is that so? In fact, I dote upon roses, said Anthony airily. A very slight smile hovered upon Mr. Fish's lips, and at the same time Anthony also smiled. The tension seemed to relax. Look at this beauty now, said Mr. Fish, stooping to point out a particularly fine bloom. Madame Abel Châtenay, I presume it to be. Yes, I am right. This white rose before the war was known as Frau Karl Drusky. They have, I believe, renamed it. Oversensitive, perhaps, but truly patriotic. The La France is always popular. Do you care for red roses at all, Mr. Cade? A bright scarlet rose now. Mr. Fish's slow, drawling voice was interrupted. Bundle was leaning out of a first-floor window. Care for a spin to town, Mr. Fish? I'm just off. Thank you, Lady Eileen, but I am very happy here. Sure you won't change your mind, Mr. Cade? Anthony laughed and shook his head. Bundle disappeared. "Sleep is more in my line," said Anthony with a wide yawn. "A good after-luncheon nap." He took out a cigarette. "You haven't got a match, have you?" Mr. Fish handed him a matchbox. Anthony helped himself and handed back the box with a word of thanks. "Roses," said Anthony, "are all very well, but I don't feel particularly horticultural this afternoon." With a disarming smile, he nodded cheerfully. A thundering noise sounded from just outside the house. "Pretty powerful engine she's got in that car of hers," remarked Anthony. "There, off she goes." They had a view of the car speeding down the long drive. Anthony yawned again and strolled towards the house. He passed in through the door. Once inside, he seemed as though changed to quicksilver. He raced across the hall, out through one of the windows on the farther side, and across the park. Bundle, he knew, had to make a big detour by the lodge gates and through the village. He ran desperately. It was a race against time. He reached the park wall just as he heard the car outside. He swung himself up and dropped into the road. "Hi!" cried Anthony. In her astonishment, Bundle swerved half across the road. She managed to pull up without accident. Anthony ran after the car, opened the door, and jumped in beside Bundle. "I'm coming to London with you," he said. "I meant to all along." "Extraordinary person," said Bundle. "What's that you've got in your hand?" "Only a match," said Anthony. He regarded it thoughtfully. It was pink with a yellow head. He threw away his unlighted cigarette and put the match carefully into his pocket. Chapter 24. The House at Dover. "You don't mind, I suppose," said Bundle after a minute or two, "if I drive rather fast? I started later than I meant to do." It had seemed to Anthony that they were proceeding at a terrific speed already, but he soon saw that that was nothing compared to what Bundle could get out of the Panhard if she tried. "Some people," said Bundle, as she slowed down momentarily to pass through a village, "are terrified of my driving. Poor old father, for instance. Nothing would induce him to come up with me in this old bus." Privately, Anthony thought Lord Caterham was entirely justified. Driving with Bundle was not a sport to be indulged in by nervous, middle-aged gentlemen. "But you don't seem nervous a bit," continued Bundle approvingly, as she swept round a corner on two wheels. "I'm in pretty good training, you see," explained Anthony gravely. "Also," he added, as an afterthought, "I'm rather in a hurry myself." "Shall I speed her up a bit more?" asked Bundle kindly. "Good Lord, no," said Anthony hastily. "We're averaging about 50 as it is." "I'm burning with curiosity to know the reason of this sudden departure," said Bundle, after executing a fanfare upon the klaxon which must temporarily have deafened the neighbourhood. "But I suppose I mustn't ask. You're not escaping from justice, are you?" "I'm not quite sure," said Anthony. "I shall know soon." "That Scotland Yard man isn't as much of a rabbit as I thought," said Bundle thoughtfully. "Battle's a good man," agreed Anthony. "You ought to have been in diplomacy," remarked Bundle. "You don't part with much information, do you?" "I was under the impression that I babbled." "Oh, boy, you're not eloping with Mademoiselle Brune by any chance?" "Not guilty," said Anthony with fervour. There was a pause of some minutes during which Bundle caught up and passed 3 other cars. Then she asked suddenly, "How long have you known Virginia?" "That's a difficult question to answer," said Anthony with perfect truth. "I haven't actually met her very often, and yet I seem to have known her a long time." Bundle nodded. "Virginia's got brains," she remarked abruptly. "She's always talking nonsense, but she's got brains all right. She was frightfully good out in Czechoslovakia, I believe. If Tim Revel had lived, he'd have had a fine career. And mostly owing to Virginia. She worked for him tooth and nail. She did everything in the world she could for him. And I know why, too." "Because she cared for him." Anthony sat looking very straight ahead of him. "No, because she didn't. Don't you see? She didn't love him. She never loved him. and so she did everything on earth she could to make up. That's Virginia all over, but don't you make any mistake about it. Virginia was never in love with Tim Revel. You seem very positive, said Anthony, turning to look at her. Bundle's little hands were clenched on the steering wheel, and her chin was stuck out in a determined manner. I know a thing or two. I was only a kid at the time of her marriage, but I heard one or two things, and knowing Virginia, I can put them together easily enough. Tim Revel was bowled over by Virginia. He was Irish, you know, and most attractive, with a genius for expressing himself well. Virginia was quite young, 18. She couldn't go anywhere without seeing Tim in a state of picturesque misery, vowing he'd shoot himself or take to drink if she didn't marry him. Girls believe these things, or used to. We've advanced a lot in the last 8 years. Virginia was carried away by the feeling she thought she'd inspired. She married him, and she was an angel to him always. She wouldn't have been half as much of an angel if she'd loved him. There's a lot of the devil in Virginia, but I can tell you one thing. She enjoys her freedom, and anyone will have a hard time persuading her to give it up. I wonder why you tell me all this, said Anthony slowly. It's interesting to know about people, isn't it? Some people, that is. I've wanted to know, he acknowledged. And you'd never have heard from Virginia. But you can trust me for an inside tip from the stables. Virginia's a darling. Even women like her because she isn't a bit of a cat. And anyway, Bundle ended, somewhat obscurely, one must be a sport. Mustn't one? Oh, certainly, Anthony agreed, but he was still puzzled. He had no idea what had prompted Bundle to give him so much information unasked. That he was glad of it, he did not deny. Here are the trams, said Bundle with a sigh. Now, I suppose I shall have to drive carefully. It might be as well, agreed Anthony. His ideas and Bundle's on the subject of careful driving hardly coincided. Leaving indignant suburbs behind them, they finally emerged into Oxford Street. Not bad going, eh? Said Bundle, glancing at her wristwatch. Anthony assented fervently. Where do you want to be dropped? Anywhere. Which way are you going? Knightsbridge way. All right, drop me at Hyde Park Corner. Goodbye, said Bundle as she drew up at the place indicated. What about the return journey? I'll find my own way back, thanks very much. I have scared him, remarked Bundle. I shouldn't recommend driving with you as a tonic for nervous old ladies, but personally, I've enjoyed it. The last time I was in equal danger was when I was charged by a herd of wild elephants. I think you're extremely rude, remarked Bundle. We've not even had one bump today. I'm sorry if you've been holding yourself in on my account, retorted Anthony. I don't think men are really very brave, said Bundle. That's a nasty one, said Anthony. I retire, humiliated. Bundle nodded and drove on. Anthony hailed a passing taxi. Victoria Station, he said to the driver as he got in. When he got to Victoria, he paid off the taxi and inquired for the next train to Dover. Unfortunately, he had just missed one. Resigning himself to a wait of something over an hour, Anthony paced up and down, his brows knit. Once or twice he shook his head impatiently. The journey to Dover was uneventful. Arrived there, Anthony passed quickly out of the station and then, as though suddenly remembering, he turned back again. There was a slight smile on his lips as he asked to be directed to Hurstmere, Langley Road. The road in question was a long one, leading right out of the town. According to the porter's instructions, Hurstmere was the last house. Anthony trudged along steadily. The little pucker had reappeared between his eyes. Nevertheless, there was a new elation in his manner, as always when danger was near at hand. Hurstmere was, as the porter had said, the last house in Langley Road. It stood well back, enclosed in its own grounds, which were ragged and overgrown. The place, Anthony judged, must have been empty for many years. A large iron gate swung rustily on its hinges, and the name on the gatepost was half obliterated. A lonely spot, muttered Anthony to himself, and a good one to choose. He hesitated a minute or two, glanced quickly up and down the road, which was quite deserted, and then slipped quietly past the creaking gate into the overgrown drive. He walked up it a little way and then stood listening. He was still some distance from the house. Not a sound could be heard anywhere. Some fast yellowing leaves detached themselves from one of the trees overhead and fell with a soft, rustling sound that was almost sinister in the stillness. Anthony started, then smiled. "Nerves," he murmured to himself. "Never knew I had such things before." He went on up the drive. Presently, as the drive curved, he slipped into the shrubbery and so continued his way unseen from the house. Suddenly he stood still, peering out through the leaves. Some distance away a dog was barking, but it was a sound nearer at hand that had attracted Anthony's attention. His keen hearing had not been mistaken. A man came rapidly round the corner of the house, a short, square, thick-set man, foreign in appearance. He did not pause but walked steadily on, circling the house and disappearing again. Anthony nodded to himself. "Sentry," he murmured. "They do the thing quite well." As soon as he had passed, Anthony went on, diverging to the left and so following in the footsteps of the sentry. His own footsteps were quite noiseless. The wall of the house was on his right, and presently he came to where a broad blur of light fell on the gravelled walk. The sound of several men talking together was clearly audible. "My God, what double-dyed idiots," murmured Anthony to himself. "It would serve them right to be given a fright." He stole up to the window, stooping a little so that he should not be seen. Presently he lifted his head very carefully to the level of the sill and looked in. 6 men were sprawling round a table. 4 of them were big, thick-set men, with high cheekbones and eyes set in Magyar slanting fashion. The other 2 were rat-like little men with quick gestures. The language that was being spoken was French, but the 4 big men spoke it with uncertainty and a hoarse, guttural intonation. "The boss?" growled one of these. "When will he be here?" One of the smaller men shrugged his shoulders. "Any time now." "About time too," growled the first man. "I have never seen him, this boss of yours, but oh, what great and glorious work might we not have accomplished in these days of idle waiting?" "Fool," said the other little man bitingly. "Getting nabbed by the police is all the great and glorious work you and your precious lot would have been likely to accomplish. A lot of blundering guerrillas?" "Aha!" roared another big, thick-set fellow. "You insult the comrades? I will soon set the sign of the red hand round your throat." He half rose, glaring ferociously at the Frenchman, but one of his companions pulled him back again. "No quarrelling," he grunted. "We're to work together. From all I heard, this King Victor doesn't stand for being disobeyed." In the darkness, Anthony heard the footsteps of the sentry coming his round again, and he drew back behind a bush. "Who's that?" said one of the men inside. "Carlo, going his rounds." "Oh, what about the prisoner?" "He's all right, coming round pretty fast now. He's recovered well from the crack on the head we gave him." Anthony moved gently away. "God, what a lot," he muttered. "They discuss their affairs with an open window, and that fool Carlo goes his round with the tread of an elephant and the eyes of a bat. And to crown all, the Herzegovinians and the French are on the point of coming to blows. King Victor's headquarters seem to be in a parlous condition. It would amuse me very much, to teach them a lesson." He stood irresolute for a minute, smiling to himself. From somewhere above his head came a stifled groan. Anthony looked up. The groan came again. Anthony glanced quickly from left to right. Carlo was not due round again just yet. He grasped the heavy Virginia creeper and climbed nimbly till he reached the sill of a window. The window was shut, but with a tool from his pocket he soon succeeded in forcing up the catch. He paused a minute to listen, then sprang lightly inside the room. There was a bed in the far corner, and on that bed a man was lying, his figure barely discernible in the gloom. Anthony went over to the bed and flashed his pocket torch on the man's face. It was a foreign face, pale and emaciated, and the head was swathed in heavy bandages. The man was bound hand and foot. He stared up at Anthony like one dazed. Anthony bent over him, and as he did so, he heard a sound behind him and swung round, his hand travelling to his coat pocket. But a sharp command arrested him. "Hands up, Sonny. You didn't expect to see me here, but I happened to catch the same train as you at Victoria." It was Mr. Hiram Fish who was standing in the doorway. He was smiling, and in his hand was a big blue automatic. Chapter 25. Tuesday night at Chimneys. Lord Caterham, Virginia and Bundle were sitting in the library after dinner. It was Tuesday evening. Some 30 hours had elapsed since Anthony's rather dramatic departure. For at least the 7th time, Bundle repeated Anthony's parting words, as spoken at Hyde Park Corner. "I'll find my own way back," repeated Virginia thoughtfully. "That doesn't look as though he expected to be away as long as this. And he's left all his things here." "He didn't tell you where he was going?" "No," said Virginia, looking straight in front of her. "He told me nothing." After this, there was a silence for a minute or two. Lord Caterham was the first to break it. "On the whole," he said, "keeping an hotel has some advantages over keeping a country house." "Meaning?" "That little notice they always hang up in your room. Visitors intending departure must give notice before 12 o'clock. Virginia smiled. "I dare say," he continued, "that I am old-fashioned and unreasonable. It's the fashion I know to pop in and out of a house. Same idea as an hotel. Perfect freedom of action, and no bill at the end." "You are an old grouser," said Bundle. "You've had Virginia and me. What more do you want?" "Nothing more, nothing more," Lord Caterham assured them hastily. "That's not it at all. It's the principle of the thing. It gives one such a restless feeling. I'm quite willing to admit that it's been an almost ideal 24 hours. Peace, perfect peace. No burglaries or other crimes of violence, no detectives, no Americans. What I complain of is that I should have enjoyed it all so much more if I'd felt really secure. As it is, all the time I've been saying to myself, one or other of them is bound to turn up in a minute. And that spoilt the whole thing." "Well, nobody has turned up," said Bundle. "We've been left severely alone, neglected, in fact. It's odd the way Fish disappeared. Didn't he say anything?" "Not a word. Last time I saw him, he was pacing up and down the rose garden yesterday afternoon, smoking one of those unpleasant cigars of his. After that, he seems to have just melted into the landscape." "Somebody must have kidnapped him," said Bundle hopefully. "In another day or two, I expect we shall have Scotland Yard dragging the lake to find his dead body," said her father gloomily. "It serves me right. At my time of life, I ought to have gone quietly abroad and taken care of my health, and not allowed myself to be drawn into George Lomax's wildcat schemes. He was interrupted by Treadwell. "Well," said Lord Caterham irritably, "what is it?" "The French detective is here, my lord, and would be glad if you could spare him a few minutes." "What did I tell you?" said Lord Caterham. "I knew it was too good to last. Depend upon it, they've found Fish's dead body doubled up in the goldfish pond." Treadwell, in a strictly respectful manner, steered him back to the point of issue. "Am I to say that you will see him, my lord?" Yes. Bring him in here." Treadwell departed. He returned a minute or two later, announcing in a lugubrious voice, "Monsieur Lemoyne." The Frenchman came in with a quick, light step. His walk, more than his face, betrayed the fact that he was excited about something. "Good evening, Lemoyne," said Lord Caterham. "Have a drink, won't you?" "I thank you, no." He bowed punctiliously to the ladies. "At last I make progress. As things are, I felt that you should be acquainted with the discoveries. the very grave discoveries that I have made in the course of the last 24 hours. I thought there must be something important going on somewhere, said Lord Caterham. My lord, yesterday afternoon one of your guests left this house in a curious manner. From the beginning, I must tell you, I have had my suspicions. Here is a man who comes from the wilds. 2 months ago, he was in South Africa. Before that, where? Virginia drew a sharp breath. For a moment the Frenchman's eyes rested on her doubtfully. Then he went on. Before that, where? None can say. And he is just such a one as the man I am looking for. Gay, audacious, reckless, one who would dare anything. I send cable after cable, but I can get no word as to his past life. 10 years ago he was in Canada, yes, but since then, silence. My suspicions grow stronger. Then I picked up one day a scrap of paper where he has lately passed along. It bears an address, the address of a house in Dover. Later, as though by chance, I drop that same piece of paper. Out of the tail of my eye, I see this Boris, this Herzegovslovakian, pick it up and take it to his master. All along I have been sure that this Boris is an emissary of the comrades of the Red Hand. We know that the comrades are working in with King Victor over this affair. If Boris recognised his chief in Mr. Anthony Cade, would he not do just what he has done? Transferred his allegiance. Why should he attach himself otherwise to an insignificant stranger? It was suspicious, I tell you, very suspicious. But almost I am disarmed, for Anthony Cade brings this same paper to me at once and asks me if I have dropped it. As I say, almost I am disarmed, but not quite. For it may mean that he is innocent, or it may mean that he is very, very clever. I deny, of course, that it is mine or that I dropped it, but in the meantime I have set inquiries on foot. Only today I have news. The house at Dover has been precipitately abandoned, but up till yesterday afternoon it was occupied by a body of foreigners. Not a doubt, but that it was King Victor's headquarters. Now see the significance of these points. Yesterday afternoon Mr. Cade clears out from here precipitately. Ever since he dropped that paper, he must know that the game is up. He reaches Dover and immediately the gang is disbanded. What the next move will be, I do not know. What is quite certain is that Mr. Anthony Cade will not return here. But knowing King Victor as I do, I am certain that he will not abandon the game without having one more try for the jewel. And that is when I shall get him. Virginia stood up suddenly. She walked across to the mantelpiece and spoke in a voice that rang cold like steel. You are leaving one thing out of account, I think, Monsieur Lemoyne, she said. Mr. Cade is not the only guest who disappeared yesterday in a suspicious manner. You mean, Madame? That all you have said applies equally well to another person. What about Mr. Hiram Fish? Oh, Mr. Fish. Yes, Mr. Fish. Did you not tell us that first night that King Victor had lately come to England from America? So has Mr. Fish come to England from America. It is true that he brought a letter of introduction from a very well-known man, but surely that would be a simple thing for a man like King Victor to manage. He is certainly not what he pretends to be. Lord Caterham has commented on the fact that when it is a question of the first editions he is supposed to have come here to see, he is always the listener, never the talker. And there are several suspicious facts against him. There was a light in his window the night of the murder. Then take that evening in the council chamber. When I met him on the terrace he was fully dressed. He could have dropped the paper. You didn't actually see Mr. Cade do so. Mr. Cade may have gone to Dover. If he did, it was simply to investigate. He may have been kidnapped there. I say that there is far more suspicion attaching to Mr. Fish's actions than to Mr. Cade's. The Frenchman's voice rang out sharply. From your point of view, that well may be, madame. I do not dispute it, and I agree that Mr. Fish is not what he seems. Well then? But that makes no difference. You see, madame, Mr. Fish is a Pinkerton's man. What? Cried Lord Kettering. Yes, Lord Kettering. He came over here to trail King Victor. Superintendent Battle and I have known this for some time. Virginia said nothing. Very slowly she sat down again. With those few words, the structure that she had built up so carefully was scattered in ruins about her feet. You see, Lemoyne was continuing, we have all known that eventually King Victor would come to Chimneys. It was the one place we were sure of catching him. Virginia looked up with an odd light in her eyes, and suddenly she laughed. You've not caught him yet? She said. Lemoyne looked at her curiously. No, madame, but I shall. He's supposed to be rather famous for outwitting people, isn't he? The Frenchman's face darkened with anger. This time it will be different, he said between his teeth. He's a very attractive fellow, said Lord Kettering. Very attractive? But surely, why, you said he was an old friend of yours, Virginia? That is why, said Virginia composedly, I think Monsieur Lemoyne must be making a mistake. And her eyes met the detective's steadily, but he appeared in no wise discomfited. Time will show, madame, he said. Do you pretend that it was he who shot Prince Michael? She asked presently. Certainly, but Virginia shook her head. Oh no, she said. Oh no, that is one thing I am quite sure of. Anthony Cade never killed Prince Michael. Lemoyne was watching her intently. There is a possibility that you are right, madam, he said slowly. A possibility, that is all. It may have been the Czechoslovakian, Boris, who exceeded his orders and fired that shot. Who knows, Prince Michael may have done him some great wrong, and the man sought revenge. He looks a murderous sort of fellow, agreed Lord Kettering. The housemaids, I believe, scream when he passes them in the passages. Well, said Lemoyne, I must be going now. I felt it was due to you, my lord, to know exactly how things stand. Very kind of you, I'm sure, said Lord Kettering. Quite certain you won't have a drink? All right, then. Good night. I hate that man with his prim little black beard and his eyeglasses, said Bundle, as soon as the door had shut behind him. I hope Anthony does snoo him. I'd love to see him dancing with rage. What do you think about it all, Virginia? I don't know, said Virginia. I'm tired. I shall go up to bed. Not a bad idea, said Lord Kettering. It's 11:30. As Virginia was crossing the wide hall, she caught sight of a broad back that seemed familiar to her discreetly vanishing through a side door. Superintendent Battle, she called imperiously. The superintendent, for it was indeed he, retraced his steps with a shade of unwillingness. Yes, Mrs. Revel? Lemoyne has been here. He says, tell me, is it true, really true, that Mr. Fish is an American detective? Superintendent Battle nodded. That's right. You have known it all along. Again, Superintendent Battle nodded. Virginia turned away towards the staircase. I see, she said, thank you. Until that minute she had refused to believe. And now? Sitting down before her dressing table in her own room, she faced the question squarely. Every word that Anthony had said came back to her fraught with a new significance. Was this the trade that he had spoken of? The trade that he had given up? But then, an unusual sound disturbed the even tenor of her meditations. She lifted her head with a start. Her little gold clock showed the hour to be after 1. Nearly 2 hours she had sat here thinking. Again the sound was repeated. A sharp tap on the window pane. Virginia went to the window and opened it. Below on the pathway was a tall figure which, even as she looked, stooped for another handful of gravel. For a moment Virginia's heart beat faster. Then she recognised the massive strength and square-cut outline of the Czechoslovakian. Boris. Yes, she said in a low tone. What is it? At the moment it did not strike her as strange that Boris should be throwing gravel at her window at this hour of the night. "What is it?" she repeated impatiently. "I come from the master," said Boris in a low tone which nevertheless carried perfectly. "He has sent for you." He made the statement in a perfectly matter-of-fact tone. "Sent for me?" "Yes, I am to bring you to him. There is a note. I will throw it up to you." Virginia stood back a little, and a slip of paper weighted with a stone fell accurately at her feet. She unfolded it and read. "My dear," Anthony had written, "I'm in a tight place, but I mean to win through. Will you trust me and come to me?" For quite 2 minutes Virginia stood there immovable, reading those few words over again and again. She raised her head, looking round the well-appointed luxury of the bedroom, as though she saw it with new eyes. Then she leaned out of the window again. "What am I to do?" she asked. "The detectives are the other side of the house, outside the council chamber. Come down and out through this side door. I will be there. I have a car waiting outside in the road." Virginia nodded. Quickly she changed her dress for one of fawn tricot and pulled on a little fawn leather hat. Then, smiling a little, she wrote a short note, addressed it to Bundle, and pinned it to the pincushion. She stole quietly downstairs and undid the bolts of the side door. Just a moment she paused, then, with a little gallant toss of the head, the same toss of the head which her ancestors had gone into action in the Crusades, she passed through. Chapter 26. The 13th of October. At 10 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday, the 13th of October, Anthony Cade walked into Harridge's hotel and asked for Baron Lolloprechel, who was occupying a suite there. After suitable and imposing delay, Anthony was taken to the suite in question. The Baron was standing on the hearthrug in a correct and stiff fashion. Little Captain Andrassy, equally correct as to demeanour, but with a slightly hostile attitude, was also present. The usual bows, clicking of heels, and other formal greetings of etiquette took place. Anthony was, by now, thoroughly conversant with the routine. "You will forgive this early call, I trust, Baron," he said cheerfully, laying down his hat and stick on the table. "As a matter of fact, I have a little business proposition to make to you." "Ha! Is that so?" said the Baron. Captain Andrassy, who had never overcome his initial distrust of Anthony, looked suspicious. "Business," said Anthony, "is based on the well-known principle of supply and demand. You want something, the other man has it. The only thing left to settle is the price." The Baron looked at him attentively, but said nothing. "Between a Herzoslovakian nobleman and an English gentleman the terms should be easily arranged," said Anthony rapidly. He blushed a little as he said it. Such words do not rise easily to an Englishman's lips, but he had observed on previous occasions the enormous effect of such phraseology upon the Baron's mentality. True enough, the charm worked. "That is so," said the Baron approvingly, nodding his head. "That is entirely so." Even Captain Andrassy appeared to unbend a little, and nodded his head also. "Very good," said Anthony. "I won't beat about the bush any more." "What is that, you say?" interrupted the Baron. "To beat about the bush? I do not comprehend." "A mere figure of speech, Baron. To speak in plain English, you want the goods, we have them. The ship is all very well, but it lacks a figurehead. By the ship, I mean the loyalist party of Herzoslovakia. At the present minute, you lack the principal plank of your political programme. You are minus a prince. Now, supposing, only supposing, that I could supply you with a prince." The Baron stared. "I do not comprehend you in the least," he declared. "Sir," said Captain Andrassy, twirling his moustache fiercely, "you are insulting." "Not at all," said Anthony. "I'm trying to be helpful. Supply and demand, you understand. It's all perfectly fair and square. No prince is supplied unless genuine. See trademark. If we come to terms, you'll find it's quite all right. I'm offering you the real genuine article, out of the bottom drawer." "Not in the least," the Baron declared again. "Do I comprehend you?" "It doesn't really matter," said Anthony kindly. "I just want you to get used to the idea. To put it vulgarly, I've got something up my sleeve. Just get hold of this. You want a prince. Under certain conditions, I will undertake to supply you with one." The Baron and Andrassy stared at him. Anthony took up his hat and stick again and prepared to depart. "Just think it over. Now, Baron, there is one thing further. You must come down to Chimneys this evening. Captain Andrassy also. Several very curious things are likely to happen there. Shall we make an appointment? Say in the council chamber at 9 o'clock. Thank you, gentlemen. I may rely upon you to be there." The Baron took a step forward and looked searchingly in Anthony's face. "Mr. Cade," he said, not without dignity, "it is not, I hope, that you wish to make fun of me." Anthony returned his gaze steadily. "Baron," he said, and there was a curious note in his voice, "when this evening is over, I think you will be the first to admit that there is more earnest than jest about this business." Bowing to both the men, he left the room. His next call was in the city, where he sent in his card to Mr. Herman Isaacstein. After some delay, Anthony was received by a pale and exquisitely dressed underling with an engaging manner and a military title. "You wanted to see Mr. Isaacstein, didn't you?" said the young man. "I'm afraid he's most awfully busy this morning. Board meetings and all that sort of thing, you know. Is it anything that I can do?" "I must see him personally," said Anthony, and added carelessly, "I've just come up from Chimneys." The young man was slightly staggered by the mention of Chimneys. "Oh," he said doubtfully. "Well, I'll see." "Tell him it's important," said Anthony. "Message from Lord Caterham?" suggested the young man. "Something of the kind," said Anthony, "but it's imperative that I should see Mr. Isaacstein at once." 2 minutes later, Anthony was conducted into a sumptuous inner sanctum, where he was principally impressed by the immense size and roomy depths of the leather-covered armchairs. Mr. Isaacstein rose to greet him. "You must forgive my looking you up like this," said Anthony. "I know that you're a busy man, and I'm not going to waste more of your time than I can help. It's just a little matter of business that I want to put before you." Isaacstein looked at him attentively for a minute or two out of his beady black eyes. "Have a cigar," he said unexpectedly, holding out an open box. "Thank you," said Anthony. "I don't mind if I do." He helped himself. "It's about this Herzeslavakian business," continued Anthony, as he accepted a match. He noted the momentary flickering of the other's steady gaze. "The murder of Prince Michael must have rather upset the apple cart." Mr. Isaacstein raised one eyebrow, murmured "Ah?" interrogatively, and transferred his gaze to the ceiling. "Oil," said Anthony, thoughtfully surveying the polished surface of the desk. "Wonderful thing, oil." He felt the slight start the financier gave. "Do you mind coming to the point, Mr. Cade?" "Not at all. I imagine, Mr. Isaacstein, that if those oil concessions are granted to another company, you won't be exactly pleased about it." "What's the proposition?" asked the other, looking straight at him. "A suitable claimant to the throne, full of pro-British sympathies." "Where have you got him?" "That's my business." Isaacstein acknowledged the retort by a slight smile. His glance had grown hard and keen. "The genuine article? I can't stand for any funny business. The absolute genuine article. Straight? Straight. I'll take your word for it." "You don't seem to take much convincing," said Anthony, looking curiously at him. Herman Isaacstein smiled. "I shouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't learnt to know whether a man is speaking the truth or not," he replied simply. "What terms do you want?" "The same loan, on the same conditions that you offered to Prince Michael." "What about yourself?" "For the moment, nothing, except that I want you to come down to Chimneys tonight." "No," said Isaacstein, with some decision. "I can't do that." "Why?" "Dining out. Rather an important dinner." "All the same, I'm afraid you'll have to cut it out." For your own sake. What do you mean? Anthony looked at him for a full minute before he said slowly, Do you know that they found the revolver, the one Michael was shot with? Do you know where they found it? In your suitcase. What? Isaacstein almost leapt from his chair. His face was frenzied. What are you saying? What do you mean? I'll tell you. Very obligingly, Anthony narrated the occurrences in connection with the finding of the revolver. As he spoke, the other's face assumed a greyish tinge of absolute terror. But it's false, he screamed out as Anthony finished. I never put it there. I know nothing about it. It is a plot. Don't excite yourself, said Anthony soothingly. If that's the case, you'll easily be able to prove it. Prove it? How can I prove it? If I were you, said Anthony gently, I'd come to Chimneys tonight. Isaacstein looked at him doubtfully. You advise it? Anthony leant forward and whispered to him. The financier fell back in amazement, staring at him. You actually mean? Come and see, said Anthony. Chapter 27. The 13th of October. Conte. The clock in the council chamber struck 9. Well, said Lord Caterham, with a deep sigh, here they all are, just like little Bo Peep's flock, back again and wagging their tails behind them. He looked sadly round the room. Organ grinder complete with monkey, he murmured, fixing the Baron with his eye. Nosy Parker of Throgmorton Street. I think you're rather unkind to the Baron, protested Bundle, to whom these confidences were being poured out. He told me that he considered you the perfect example of English hospitality amongst the haute noblesse. I dare say, said Lord Caterham. He's always saying things like that. It makes him most fatiguing to talk to. But I can tell you I'm not nearly as much of the hospitable English gentleman as I was. As soon as I can, I shall let Chimneys to an enterprising American and go and live in an hotel. There, if anyone worries you, you can just ask for your bill and go. Cheer up, said Bundle. We seem to have lost Mr. Fish for good. I always found him rather amusing, said Lord Caterham, who was in a contradictory temper. It's that precious young man of yours who has let me in for this. Why should I have this board meeting called in my house? Why doesn't he rent the Larches or Elmhurst or some nice villa residence like that at Streatham and hold his company meetings there? Wrong atmosphere, said Bundle. No one is going to play any tricks on us, I hope, said her father nervously. I don't trust that French fellow, Lemoyne. The French police are up to all sorts of dodges. Put India rubber bands round your arm and then reconstruct the crime and make you jump, and it's registered on a thermometer. I know that when they call out, Who killed Prince Michael? I shall register 122, or something perfectly frightful, and they'll haul me off to jail at once. The door opened and Treadwell announced, Mr. George Lomax, Mr. Eversley. Enter Codders, followed by Faithful Dog, murmured Bundle. Bill made a beeline for her, whilst George greeted Lord Caterham in the genial manner he assumed for public occasions. My dear Caterham, said George, shaking him by the hand, I got your message and came over, of course. Very good of you, my dear fellow, very good of you. Delighted to see you. Lord Caterham's conscience always drove him on to an excess of geniality when he was conscious of feeling none. Not that it was my message, but that doesn't matter at all. In the meantime, Bill was attacking Bundle in an undertone. I say, what's it all about? What's this I hear about Virginia bolting off in the middle of the night? She's not been kidnapped, has she? Oh no, said Bundle. She left a note pinned to the pincushion in the orthodox fashion. She's not gone off with anyone, has she? Not with that colonial Johnny? I never liked the fellow, and, from all I hear, there seems to be an idea floating around that he himself is the super crook, but I don't quite see how that can be. Why not? Well, this King Victor was a French fellow, and Cade's English enough. You don't happen to have heard that King Victor was an accomplished linguist, and moreover, was half Irish? Oh, Lord! Then that's why he's made himself scarce, is it? I don't know about his making himself scarce. He disappeared the day before yesterday, as you know. But this morning we got a wire from him saying he would be down here at 9 p.m. tonight and suggesting that codders should be asked over. All these other people have turned up as well, asked by Mr. Cade. It is a gathering, said Bill, looking round. One French detective by window, one English ditto by fireplace. Strong foreign element. The Stars and Stripes don't seem to be represented. Bundle shook her head. Mr. Fish has disappeared into the blue. Virginia's not here either. But everyone else is assembled, and I have a feeling in my bones, Bill, that we are drawing very near to the moment when somebody says James, the footman, and everything is revealed. We're only waiting now for Anthony Cade to arrive. He'll never show up, said Bill. Then why call this company meeting, as father calls it? Ah, there's some deep idea behind that. Depend upon it. Wants us all here while he's somewhere else. You know the sort of thing. You don't think he'll come, then? No fear. Run his head into the lion's mouth? Why, the room's bristling with detectives and high officials. You don't know much about King Victor, if you think that would deter him. By all accounts, it's the kind of situation he loves above all, and he always manages to come out on top. Mr. Eversley shook his head doubtfully. That would take some doing, with the dice loaded against him. He'll never— The door opened again, and Treadwell announced, Mr. Cade. Anthony came straight across to his host. Lord Caterham, he said, I'm giving you a frightful lot of trouble, and I'm awfully sorry about it. But I really do think that tonight will see the clearing up of the mystery. Lord Caterham looked mollified. He had always had a secret liking for Anthony. No trouble at all, he said heartily. It's very kind of you, said Anthony. We're all here, I see. Then I can get on with the good work. I don't understand, said George Lomax weightily. I don't understand in the least. This is all very irregular. Mr. Cade has no standing whatever. The position is a very difficult and delicate one. I am strongly of the opinion. George's flood of eloquence was arrested. Moving unobtrusively to the great man's side, Superintendent Battle whispered a few words in his ear. George looked perplexed and baffled. Very well, if you say so, he remarked grudgingly, then added in a louder tone, I'm sure we are all willing to listen to what Mr. Cade has to say. Anthony ignored the palpable condescension of the other's tone. It's just a little idea of mine, that's all, he said cheerfully. Probably all of you know that we got hold of a certain message in cipher the other day. There was a reference to Richmond and some numbers. He paused. Well, we had a shot at solving it, and we failed. Now, in the late Count Stilptich's memoirs, which I happen to have read, there is a reference to a certain dinner, a flower dinner, which everyone attended wearing a badge representing a flower. The Count himself wore the exact duplicate of that curious device we found in the cavity in the secret passage. It represented a rose. If you remember, it was all rows of things, buttons, letter E's, and finally rows of knitting. Now, gentlemen, what is there in this house that is arranged in rows? Books, isn't that so? Add to that in the catalogue of Lord Caterham's library there is a book called The Life of the Earl of Richmond, and I think you will get a very fair idea of the hiding place. Starting at the volume in question, and using the numbers to denote shelves and books, I think you will find that the object of our search is concealed in a dummy book, or in a cavity behind a particular book. Anthony looked round modestly, obviously waiting for applause. Upon my word, that's very ingenious, said Lord Caterham. Quite ingenious, admitted George condescendingly. But it remains to be seen. Anthony laughed. The proof of the pudding's in the eating, eh? Well, I'll soon settle that for you. He sprang to his feet. I'll go to the library. He got no further. Monsieur Lemoyne moved forward from the window. Just one moment, Mr. Cade. You permit, Lord Caterham. He went to the writing table and hurriedly scribbled a few lines. He sealed them up in an envelope and then rang the bell. Treadwell appeared in answer to it. Lemoyne handed him the note. See that that is delivered at once, if you please. Very good, sir, said Treadwell. With his usual dignified tread, he withdrew. Anthony, who had been standing irresolute, sat down again. What's the big idea, Lemoyne? He asked gently. There was a sudden sense of strain in the atmosphere. If the jewel is where you say it is, well, it has been there for over 7 years. A quarter of an hour more does not matter. Go on, said Anthony. That wasn't all you wanted to say? No, it was not. At this juncture, it is unwise to permit any one person to leave the room, especially if that person has rather questionable antecedents. Anthony raised his eyebrows and lighted a cigarette. I suppose a vagabond life is not very respectable, he mused. 2 months ago, Mr. Cade, you were in South Africa. That is admitted. Where were you before that? Anthony leaned back in his chair, idly blowing smoke rings. Canada, wild northwest. Are you sure you were not in prison? A French prison? Automatically, Superintendent Battle moved a step nearer the door, as if to cut off a retreat that way, but Anthony showed no signs of doing anything dramatic. Instead, he stared at the French detective and then burst out laughing. My poor Lemoyne, it is a monomania with you. You do indeed see King Victor everywhere, so you fancy that I am that interesting gentleman. Do you deny it? Anthony brushed a fleck of ash from his coat sleeve. I never deny anything that amuses me, he said lightly, but the accusation is really too ridiculous. Ah, you think so? The Frenchman leant forward. His face was twitching painfully, and yet he seemed perplexed and baffled, as though something in Anthony's manner puzzled him. What if I tell you, monsieur, that this time, I am out to get King Victor, and nothing shall stop me? Very laudable, was Anthony's comment. You've been out to get him before, though, haven't you, Lemoyne? And he's got the better of you. Aren't you afraid that that may happen again? He's a slippery fellow by all accounts. The conversation had developed into a duel between the detective and Anthony. Everyone else in the room was conscious of the tension. It was a fight to a finish between the Frenchman, painfully in earnest, and the man who smoked so calmly, and whose words seemed to show that he had not a care in the world. If I were you, Lemoyne, continued Anthony, I should be very, very careful. Watch your step, and all that sort of thing. This time, said Lemoyne grimly, there will be no mistake. You seem very sure about it all, said Anthony, but there's such a thing as evidence, you know. Lemoyne smiled, and something in his smile seemed to attract Anthony's attention. He sat up and stubbed out his cigarette. You saw that note I wrote just now, said the French detective. It was to my people at the inn. Yesterday I received from France the fingerprints and the Bertillon measurements of King Victor, the so-called Captain O'Neill. I have asked for them to be sent up to me here. In a few minutes we shall know whether you are the man. Anthony stared steadily at him. Then a little smile crept over his face. You're really rather clever, Lemoyne. I never thought of that. The documents will arrive. You will induce me to dip my fingers in the ink, or something equally unpleasant. You will measure my ears and look for my distinguishing marks. And if they agree— Well, said Lemoyne, if they agree, eh? Anthony leaned forward in his chair. Well, if they do agree, he said very gently, what then? What then? The detective seemed taken aback. But I shall have proved then that you are King Victor. But for the first time, a shade of uncertainty crept into his manner. "That will doubtless be a great satisfaction to you," said Anthony, "but I don't quite see where it's going to hurt me. I'm not admitting anything, but supposing, just for the sake of argument, that I was King Victor. I might be trying to repent, you know." "Repent?" "That's the idea. Put yourself in King Victor's place, Lemoyne. Use your imagination. You've just come out of prison. You're getting on in life. You've lost the first fine rapture of the adventurous life. Say even that you meet a beautiful girl. You think of marrying and settling down somewhere in the country where you can grow vegetable marrows. You decide from henceforth to lead a blameless life. Put yourself in King Victor's place. Can't you imagine feeling like that?" "I do not think that I should feel like that," said Lemoyne with a sardonic smile. "Perhaps you wouldn't," admitted Anthony. "But then you're not King Victor, are you? You can't possibly know what he feels like." "But it is nonsense what you are saying there," spluttered the Frenchman. "Oh no, it isn't. Come now, Lemoyne, if I'm King Victor. What have you against me after all? You could never get the necessary evidence in the old days, remember. I've served my sentence, and that's all there is to it. I suppose you could arrest me for the French equivalent of loitering with intent to commit a felony. But that would be poor satisfaction, wouldn't it?" "You forget," said Lemoyne. "America. How about this business of obtaining money under false pretenses and passing yourself off as Prince Nicholas Obolovitch?" "No good, Lemoyne," said Anthony. "I was nowhere near America at the time, and I can prove that easily enough. If King Victor impersonated Prince Nicholas in America, then I'm not King Victor." "You're sure he was impersonated? That it wasn't the man himself?" Superintendent Battles suddenly interposed. "The man was an impostor, all right, Mr. Cade." "I wouldn't contradict you, Battle," said Anthony. "You have such a habit of being always right. Are you equally sure that Prince Nicholas died in the Congo?" Battle looked at him curiously. "I wouldn't swear to that, sir, but it's generally believed." "Careful, man. What's your motto? Plenty of rope, eh? I've taken a leaf out of your book. I've given Monsieur Lemoyne plenty of rope. I've not denied his accusations, but all the same, I'm afraid he's going to be disappointed. You see, I always believe in having something up one's sleeve." Anticipating that some little unpleasantness might arise here, I took the precaution to bring a trump card along with me. It, or rather he, is upstairs. "Upstairs?" said Lord Caterham, very interested. "Yes, he's been having rather a trying time of it lately, poor fellow. Got a nasty bump on the head from someone. I've been looking after him." Suddenly the deep voice of Mr. Isaacstein broke in. "Can we guess who he is?" "If you like," said Anthony. "But—" Lemoyne interrupted with sudden ferocity. "All this is foolery. You think to outwit me yet again. It may be true what you say, that you were not in America. You are too clever to say it if it were not true. But there is something else. Murder. Yes, murder. The murder of Prince Michael. He interfered with you that night as you were looking for the jewel." "Lemoyne, have you ever known King Victor to do murder?" Anthony's voice rang out sharply. "You know as well, better than I do, that he has never shed blood." "Who else but you could have murdered him?" cried Lemoyne. "Tell me that." The last word died on his lips as a shrill whistle sounded from the terrace outside. Anthony sprang up, all his assumed nonchalance laid aside. "You ask me who murdered Prince Michael?" he cried. "I won't tell you. I'll show you. That whistle was the signal I've been waiting for. The murderer of Prince Michael is in the library now." He sprang out through the window, and the others followed him as he led the way round the terrace until they came to the library window. He pushed the window, and it yielded to his touch. Very softly he held aside the thick velvet curtain, so that they could look into the room. Standing by the bookcase was a dark figure. hurriedly pulling out and replacing volumes, so absorbed in the task that no outside sound was heeded. And then, as they stood watching, trying to recognize the figure that was vaguely silhouetted against the light of the electric torch it carried, someone sprang past them with a sound like the roar of a wild beast. The torch fell to the ground, was extinguished, and the sounds of a terrific struggle filled the room. Lord Caterham groped his way to the lights and switched them on. Two figures were swaying together, and as they looked, the end came. The short, sharp crack of a pistol shot, and the smaller figure crumpled up and fell. The other figure turned and faced them. It was Boris, his eyes alight with rage. "She killed my master," he growled. "Now she tries to shoot me. I would have taken the pistol from her and shot her, but it went off in the struggle. St. Michael directed it. The evil woman is dead." "A woman?" cried George Lomax. They drew nearer. On the floor, the pistol still clasped in her hand, and an expression of deadly malignity on her face lay. Mademoiselle Bron. Chapter 28. King Victor. "I suspected her from the first," explained Anthony. "There was a light in her room on the night of the murder. Afterwards I wavered. I made inquiries about her in Brittany, and came back satisfied that she was what she represented herself to be. I was a fool. Because the Comtesse de Breteuil had employed a Mademoiselle Brun and spoke highly of her, it never occurred to me that the real Mademoiselle Brun might have been kidnapped on her way to her new post, and that it might be a substitute taking her place. Instead, I shifted my suspicions to Mr. Fish. It was not until he had followed me to Dover and we had had a mutual explanation that I began to see clearly. Once I knew that he was a Pinkerton's man, trailing King Victor, my suspicions swung back again to their original object. The thing that worried me most was that Mrs. Revel had definitely recognised the woman. Then I remembered that it was only after I had mentioned her being Madame de Breteuil's governess, and all she had said was that that accounted for the fact that the woman's face was familiar to her. Superintendent Battle will tell you that a deliberate plot was formed to keep Mrs. Revel from coming to Chimneys. Nothing more nor less than a dead body, in fact, and though the murder was the work of the comrades of the Red Hand, punishing supposed treachery on the part of the victim, the staging of it, and the absence of the comrades' sign manual, pointed to some abler intelligence directing operations. From the first, I suspected some connection with Czechoslovakia. Mrs. Revel was the only member of the house party who had been to the country. I suspected at first that someone was impersonating Prince Michael, but that proved to be a totally erroneous idea. When I realised the possibility of Mademoiselle Brun's being an impostor, and added to that the fact that her face was familiar to Mrs. Revel, I began to see daylight. It was evidently very important that she should not be recognised, and Mrs. Revel was the only person likely to do so. "But who was she?" said Lord Caterham. "Someone Mrs. Revel had known in Czechoslovakia." "I think the Baron might be able to tell us," said Anthony. "I?" The Baron stared at him, then down at the motionless figure. "Look well," said Anthony. "Don't be put off by the make-up. She was an actress once, remember." The Baron stared again. Suddenly he started. "God in heaven," he breathed. "It is not possible." "What is not possible?" asked George. "Who is the lady? You recognise her, Baron?" No, it is not possible." The Baron continued to mutter. "She was killed. They were both killed. On the steps of the palace. Her body was recovered." "Mutilated and unrecognisable," Anthony reminded him. "She managed to put up a bluff. I think she escaped to America and has spent a good many years lying low in deadly terror of the comrades of the Red Hand. They promoted the revolution, remember, and, to use an expressive phrase, they always had it in for her. Then King Victor was released and they planned to recover the diamond together. She was searching for it that night when she came suddenly upon Prince Michael, and he recognised her. There was never much fear of her meeting him in the ordinary way of things. Royal guests don't come in contact with governesses, and she could always retire with a convenient migraine, as she did the day the Baron was here. However, she met Prince Michael face to face when she least expected it. Exposure and disgrace stared her in the face. She shot him. It was she who placed the revolver in Isaacstein's suitcase so as to confuse the trail, and she who returned the letters. Lemoyne moved forward. She was coming down to search for the jewel that night, you say, he said. Might she not have been going to meet her accomplice, King Victor, who was coming from outside? Eh? What do you say to that? Anthony sighed. Still at it, my dear Lemoyne. How persistent you are. You won't take my hint that I've got a trump card up my sleeve. But George, whose mind worked slowly, now broke in. I am still completely at sea. Who was this lady, Baron? You recognise her, it seems. But the Baron drew himself up and stood very straight and stiff. You are in error, Mr. Lomax. To my knowledge, I have not this lady seen before. A complete stranger she is to me. But George stared at him, bewildered. The Baron took him into a corner of the room and murmured something into his ear. Anthony watched with a good deal of enjoyment, George's face turning slowly purple, his eyes bulging, and all the incipient symptoms of apoplexy. A murmur of George's throaty voice came to him. Certainly. Certainly. By all means. No need at all. Complicate situation. Utmost discretion. Ah! Lemoyne hit the table sharply with his hand. I do not care about all this. The murder of Prince Michael, that was not my affair. I want King Victor. Anthony shook his head gently. I'm sorry for you, Lemoyne. You're really a very able fellow, but all the same, you're going to lose the trick. I'm about to play my trump card. He stepped across the room and rang the bell. Treadwell answered it. A gentleman arrived with me this evening, Treadwell. Yes, sir, a foreign gentleman. Quite so. Will you kindly ask him to join us here as soon as possible? Yes, sir. Treadwell withdrew. Entry of the trump card. The mysterious Monsieur X, remarked Anthony. Who is he? Can anyone guess? Putting 2 and 2 together, said Hermann Isaacstein. What with your mysterious hints this morning and your attitude this afternoon, I should say there was no doubt about it. Somehow or other, you've managed to get hold of Prince Nicholas of Herzegovina. You think the same, Baron? I do, unless yet another impostor you have put forward. But that I will not believe. With me, your dealings most honourable have been. Thank you, Baron. I shan't forget those words. So you are all agreed? His eyes swept round the circle of waiting faces. Only Lemoyne did not respond, but kept his eyes fixed sullenly on the table. Anthony's quick ears had caught the sound of footsteps outside in the hall. And yet, you know, he said with a queer smile, you're all wrong. He crossed swiftly to the door and flung it open. A man stood on the threshold, a man with a neat black beard, eyeglasses, and a foppish appearance slightly marred by a bandage round the head. Allow me to present you to the real Monsieur Lemoine of the Sûreté. There was a rush and a scuffle, and then the nasal tones of Mr. Hiram Fish rose bland and reassuring from the window. No, you don't, Sonny. Not this way. I have been stationed here this whole evening for the particular purpose of preventing your escape. You will observe that I have you covered well and good with this gun of mine. I came over to get you, and I've got you. But you sure are some lad. Chapter 29. Further explanations. You owe us an explanation, I think, Mr. Cade, said Hermann Isaacstein, somewhat later in the evening. There's nothing much to explain, said Anthony modestly. I went to Dover and Fish followed me under the impression that I was King Victor. We found a mysterious stranger imprisoned there, and as soon as we heard his story, we knew where we were. The same idea again, you see. the real man kidnapped, and the false one, in this case, King Victor himself, takes his place. But it seems that Battle here always thought there was something fishy about his French colleague and wired to Paris for his fingerprints and other means of identification. "Ah!" cried the Baron. "The fingerprints! The Bertillon measurements that scoundrel talked about?" "It was a clever idea," said Anthony. "I admired it so much that I felt forced to play up. Besides, my doing so puzzled the false Lemoyne enormously. You see, as soon as I had given the tip about the rose, and where the jewel really was, he was keen to pass on the news to his accomplice, and at the same time to keep us all in that room. The note was really to Mademoiselle Bron. He told Treadwell to deliver it at once, and Treadwell did so by taking it upstairs to the schoolroom. Lemoyne accused me of being King Victor, by that means creating a diversion and preventing anyone from leaving the room. By the time all that had been cleared up and we adjourned to the library to look for the stone, he flattered himself that the stone would be no longer there to find. George cleared his throat. "I must say, Mr. Cade," he said pompously, "that I consider your action in that matter highly reprehensible. If the slightest hitch had occurred in your plans, one of our national possessions might have disappeared beyond the hope of recovery. It was foolhardy, Mr. Cade, reprehensibly foolhardy." "I guess you haven't tumbled to the little idea, Mr. Lomax," said the drawling voice of Mr. Fish. "That historic diamond was never behind the books, in the library." "Never?" "Not on your life." "You see," explained Anthony, "that little device of Count Stilptich's stood for what it had originally stood for. A rose. When that dawned upon me on Monday afternoon, I went straight to the rose garden. Mr. Fish had already tumbled to the same idea. If, standing with your back to the sundial, you take 7 paces straight forward, then 8 to the left and 3 to the right, you come to some bushes of a bright red rose called Richmond. The house has been ransacked to find the hiding place, but nobody has thought of digging in the garden. I suggest a little digging party tomorrow morning. Then the story about the books in the library. An invention of mine to trap the lady. Mr. Fish kept watch on the terrace and whistled when the psychological moment had arrived. I may say that Mr. Fish and I established martial law at the Dover House and prevented the comrades from communicating with the false Lemoyne. He sent them an order to clear out, and word was conveyed to him that this had been done. So he went happily ahead with his plans for denouncing me." "Well, well," said Lord Caterham cheerfully. "Everything seems to have been cleared up most satisfactorily." "Everything but one thing," said Mr. Isaacstein. "What is that?" The great financier looked steadily at Anthony. "What did you get me down here for? Just to assist at a dramatic scene as an interested onlooker?" Anthony shook his head. "No, Mr. Isaacstein. You are a busy man whose time is money. Why did you come down here originally?" "To negotiate a loan." "With whom? Prince Michael of Herzegovina?" "Exactly. Prince Michael is dead. Are you prepared to offer the same loan on the same terms to his cousin Nicholas? Can you produce him? I thought he was killed in the Congo." "He was killed all right. I killed him. Oh no, I'm not a murderer. When I say I killed him, I mean that I spread the report of his death. I promised you a prince, Mr. Isaacstein. Will I do?" "You?" "Yes, I'm the man. Nicholas Sergius Alexander Ferdinand Obolovich. Rather long for the kind of life I proposed to live, so I emerged from the Congo as plain Anthony Cade." Little Captain Andrassy sprang up. "But this is incredible, incredible," he spluttered. "Have a care, sir, what you say." "I can give you plenty of proofs," said Anthony quietly. "I think I shall be able to convince the Baron here." The Baron lifted his hand. "Your proofs I will examine, yes. But of them for me there is no need. Your word alone sufficient for me is. Besides, your English mother you much resemble. All along have I said, this young man on one side or the other most highly born is. You have always trusted my word, Baron, said Anthony. I can assure you that in the days to come I shall not forget. Then he looked over at Superintendent Battle, whose face had remained perfectly expressionless. You can understand, said Anthony with a smile, that my position has been extremely precarious. Of all those in the house, I might be supposed to have the best reason for wishing Michael Abolovitch out of the way since I was the next heir to the throne. I've been extraordinarily afraid of Battle all along. I always felt that he suspected me, but that he was held up by lack of motive. I never believed for a minute that you'd shot him, sir, said Superintendent Battle. We've got a feeling in such matters. But I knew that you were afraid of something, and you puzzled me. If I'd known sooner who you really were, I dare say I'd have yielded to the evidence and arrested you. I'm glad I managed to keep one guilty secret from you. You wormed everything else out of me all right. You're a damned good man at your job, Battle. I shall always think of Scotland Yard with respect. Most amazing, muttered George. Most amazing story I ever heard. I can really hardly believe it. You are quite sure, Baron, that— My dear Mr. Lomax, said Anthony, with a slight hardness in his tone, I have no intention of asking the British Foreign Office to support my claim without bringing forward the most convincing documentary evidence. I suggest that we adjourn now, and that you, the Baron, Mr. Isaacstein and myself discuss the terms of the proposed loan. The Baron rose to his feet and clicked his heels together. It will be the proudest moment of my life, sir, he said solemnly, when I see you King of Herzegovina. Oh, by the way, Baron, said Anthony carelessly, slipping his hand through the other's arm, I forgot to tell you. There's a string tied to this. I'm married, you know. The Baron retreated a step or two. Dismay overspread his countenance. Something wrong I knew there would be, he boomed. Merciful God in heaven, he has married a black woman in Africa. Come, it's not so bad as all that, said Anthony, laughing. She's white enough, white all through, bless her. Good. A respectable morganatic affair it can be, then. Not a bit of it. She's to play queen to my king. It's no use shaking your head. She's fully qualified for the post. She's the daughter of an English peer who dates back to the time of the Conqueror. It's very fashionable just now for royalties to marry into the aristocracy, and she knows something of Herzegovina. My God, cried George Lomax, startled out of his usual careful speech. Not Virginia Revel? Yes, said Anthony, Virginia Revel. My dear fellow, cried Lord Caterham. I mean, sir, I congratulate you, I do indeed. A delightful creature. Thank you, Lord Caterham, said Anthony. She's all you say and more. But Mr. Isaacstein was regarding him curiously. You'll excuse my asking, Your Highness, but when did this marriage take place? Anthony smiled back at him. As a matter of fact, he said, I married her this morning. See, Chapter 30. Anthony signs on for a new job. If you will go on, gentlemen, I will follow you in a minute, said Anthony. He waited whilst the others filed out, and then turned to where Superintendent Battle was standing, apparently absorbed in examining the panelling. Well, Battle, want to ask me something, don't you? Well, I do, sir, though I don't know how you knew I did. But I always marked you out as being specially quick in the uptake. I take it that the lady who is dead was the late Queen Viraga. Quite right, Battle. It'll be hushed up, I hope. You can understand what I feel about family skeletons. Trust Mr. Lomax for that, sir. No one will ever know. That is, a lot of people will know, but it won't get about. Was that what you wanted to ask me about? No, sir. That was only in passing. I was curious to know just what made you drop your own name, if I'm not taking too much of a liberty. Not a bit, I'll tell you. I killed myself from the purest motives, Battle. My mother was English, I'd been educated in England, and I was far more interested in England than in Czechoslovakia. And I felt an absolute fool knocking about the world with a comic opera title tacked onto me. You see, when I was very young, I had democratic ideas, believed in the purity of ideals, and the equality of all men. I especially disbelieved in kings and princes. And since then? Asked Battle shrewdly. Oh, since then I've travelled and seen the world. There's damned little equality going about. Mind you, I still believe in democracy. But you've got to force it on people with a strong hand. Ram it down their throats. Men don't want to be brothers. They may someday, but they don't now. My final belief in the brotherhood of man died the day I arrived in London last week, when I observed the people standing in a tube train resolutely refuse to move up and make room for those who entered. You won't turn people into angels by appealing to their better natures just yet a while, but by judicious force you can coerce them into behaving more or less decently to one another to go on with. I still believe in the brotherhood of man, but it's not coming yet a while. Say another 10,000 years or so. It's no good being impatient. Evolution is a slow process. I'm very interested in these views of yours, sir, said Battle with a twinkle. And if you'll allow me to say so, I'm sure you'll make a very fine king out there. Thank you, Battle, said Anthony with a sigh. You don't seem very happy about it, sir. Oh, I don't know. I dare say it will be rather fun. But it's tying oneself down to regular work. I've always avoided that before. But you consider it your duty, I suppose, sir? Good Lord, no, what an idea. It's a woman. It's always a woman, Battle. I'd do more than be a king for her sake. Quite so, sir. I've arranged it so that the Baron and Isaacstein can't kick. The one wants a king and the other wants oil. They'll both get what they want, and I've got— Oh, Lord Battle, have you ever been in love? I am much attached to Mrs. Battle, sir. Much attached to Mrs. Oh, you don't know what I'm talking about. It's entirely different. Excuse me, sir, that man of yours is waiting outside the window. Boris? So he is. He's a wonderful fellow. It's a mercy that pistol went off in the struggle and killed the lady. Otherwise, Boris would have wrung her neck as sure as fate, and then you would have wanted to hang him. His attachment to the Abolovitch dynasty is remarkable. The queer thing was that as soon as Michael was dead, he attached himself to me, and yet he couldn't possibly have known who I really was. Instinct, said Battle, like a dog. Very awkward instinct, I thought it at the time. I was afraid it might give the show away to you. I suppose I'd better see what he wants. He went out through the window. Superintendent Battle, left alone, looked after him for a minute, then apparently addressed the panelling. He'll do, said Superintendent Battle. Outside, Boris explained himself. Master, said he, and led the way along the terrace. Anthony followed him, wondering what was forward. Presently Boris stopped and pointed with his forefinger. It was moonlight, and in front of them was a stone seat on which sat two figures. He is a dog, said Anthony to himself, and what's more, a pointer. He strode forward. Boris melted into the shadows. The two figures rose to meet him. One of them was Virginia, the other. Hullo, Joe, said a well-remembered voice. This is a great girl of yours. Jimmy McGrath, by all that's wonderful, cried Anthony. How in the name of fortune did you get here? That trip of mine into the interior went fot. Then some Dagos came monkeying round, wanted to buy that manuscript off me. Next thing I as near as nothing got a knife in the back one night. That made me think that I'd handed you out a bigger job than I knew. I thought you might need help, and I came along after you by the very next boat. Wasn't it splendid of him? Said Virginia. She squeezed Jimmy's arm. "Why didn't you ever tell me how frightfully nice he was? You are, Jimmy. You're a perfect dear." "You two seem to be getting along all right," said Anthony. "Sure thing," said Jimmy. "I was snooping around for news of you when I connected with this dame. She wasn't at all what I thought she'd be, some swell, haughty society lady that'd scare the life out of me." "He told me all about the letters," said Virginia, "and I feel almost ashamed not to have been in real trouble over them when he was such a knight-errant." "If I'd known what you were like," said Jimmy gallantly, "I'd not have given him the letters. I'd have brought them to you myself. Say, young man, is the fun really over? Is there nothing for me to do?" "By Jove," said Anthony, "there is. Wait a minute." He disappeared into the house. In a minute or two, he returned with a paper package which he cast into Jimmy's arms. "Go round to the garage and help yourself to a likely-looking car. Beat it to London and deliver that parcel at 17 Everdene Square. That's Mr. Balderson's private address. In exchange, he'll hand you £1,000. "What? It's not the memoirs? I understood that they'd been burnt." "What do you take me for?" demanded Anthony. "You don't think I'd fall for a story like that, do you? I rang up the publishers at once, found out that the other was a fake call, and arranged accordingly. I made up a dummy package as I'd been directed to do, but I put the real package in the manager's safe and handed over the dummy. The memoirs have never been out of my possession." "Bully for you, my son," said Jimmy. "Oh, Anthony," cried Virginia, "you're not going to let them be published?" "I can't help myself. I can't let a pal like Jimmy down. But you needn't worry. I've had time to wade through them, and I see now why people always hint that bigwigs don't write their own reminiscences but hire someone to do it for them. As a writer, Stilptich is an insufferable bore. He proses on about statecraft and doesn't go in for any racy and indiscreet anecdotes. His ruling passion of secrecy held strong to the end. There's not a word in the memoirs from beginning to end to flutter the susceptibilities of the most difficult politician. I rang up Balderson today and arranged with him that I'd deliver the manuscript tonight before midnight. But Jimmy can do his own dirty work now that's he's here." "I'm off," said Jimmy. "I like the idea of that £1,000, especially when I'd made up my mind I was down and out." "Half a second," said Anthony. "I've got a confession to make to you, Virginia. Something that everyone else knows, but that I haven't yet told you. I don't mind how many strange women you've loved so long as you don't tell me about them." "Women," said Anthony, with a virtuous air. "Women indeed? You ask James here what kind of women I was going about with last time he saw me." "Frumps," said Jimmy solemnly. "Utter frumps. Not one a day under 45. "Thank you, Jimmy," said Anthony. "You're a true friend." "No, it's much worse than that. I've deceived you as to my real name." "Is it very dreadful?" said Virginia with interest. "It isn't something silly like Pobbles, is it? Fancy being called Mrs. Pobbles. You are always thinking the worst of me." "I admit that I did once think you were King Victor, but only for about a minute and a half. By the way, Jimmy, I've got a job for you. Gold prospecting in the rocky fastnesses of Czechoslovakia." "Is there gold there?" asked Jimmy eagerly. "Sure to be," said Anthony. "It's a wonderful country." "So you're taking my advice and going there?" "Yes," said Anthony. "Your advice was worth more than you knew. Now for the confession. I wasn't changed at nurse, or anything romantic like that, but nevertheless I am really Prince Nicholas Obolovich of Czechoslovakia." "Oh, Anthony," cried Virginia, "how perfectly screaming! And I have married you. What are we going to do about it?" "We'll go to Czechoslovakia and pretend to be kings and queens. Jimmy McGrath once said that the average life of a king or queen out there is under 4 years. I hope you don't mind." "Mind?" cried Virginia. "I shall love it." "Isn't she great?" murmured Jimmy. Then, discreetly, he faded into the night. A few minutes later, the sound of a car was heard. "Nothing like letting a man do his own dirty work," said Anthony with satisfaction. "Besides, I didn't know how else to get rid of him. Since we were married, I've not had 1 minute alone with you." "We'll have a lot of fun," said Virginia, "teaching the brigands not to be brigands and the assassins not to assassinate, and generally improving the moral tone of the country." "I like to hear these pure ideals," said Anthony. "It makes me feel my sacrifice has not been in vain." "Rot," said Virginia calmly. "You'll enjoy being a king. It's in your blood, you know. You were brought up to the trade of royalty, and you've got a natural aptitude for it, just like plumbers have a natural bent for plumbing." "I never think they have," said Anthony. "But damn it all, don't let's waste time talking about plumbers. Do you know that at this very minute I'm supposed to be deep in conference with Isaacstein and Old Lollipop? They want to talk about oil. Oil, my God! They can just await my kingly pleasure. Virginia, do you remember my telling you once that I'd have a damned good try to make you care for me?" "I remember," said Virginia softly. But Superintendent Battle was looking out of the window. "Well, he isn't now," said Anthony. He caught her suddenly to him, kissing her eyelids, her lips, the green gold of her hair. "I do love you so, Virginia," he whispered. "I do love you so. Do you love me?" He looked down at her, sure of the answer. Her head rested against his shoulder, and very low, in a sweet, shaken voice, she answered, "Not a bit." "You little devil," cried Anthony, kissing her again. "Now I know for certain that I shall love you until I die." Chapter 31. Sundry Details. Scene: Chimneys, 11 a.m. Thursday morning, Johnson, the police constable, with his coat off. Digging. Something in the nature of a funeral feeling seems to be in the air. The friends and relations stand round the grave that Johnson is digging. George Lomax has the air of the principal beneficiary under the will of the deceased. Superintendent Battle, with his immovable face, seems pleased that the funeral arrangements have gone so nicely. As the undertaker, it reflects credit upon him. Lord Caterham has that solemn and shocked look which Englishmen assume when a religious ceremony is in progress. Mr. Fish does not fit into the picture so well. He is not sufficiently grave. Johnson bends to his task. Suddenly, he straightens up. A little stir of excitement passes round. "That'll do, sonny," says Mr. Fish. "We shall do nicely now." One perceives at once that he is really the family physician. Johnson retires. Mr. Fish, with due solemnity, stoops over the excavation. The surgeon is about to operate. He brings out a small canvas package. With much ceremony, he hands it to Superintendent Battle. The latter, in his turn, hands it to George Lomax. The etiquette of the situation has now been fully complied with. George Lomax unwraps the package, slits up the oil silk inside it, burrows into further wrapping. For a moment he holds something on the palm of his hand, then quickly shrouds it once more in cotton wool. He clears his throat. "At this auspicious minute," he begins with the clear delivery of the practised speaker. Lord Caterham beats a precipitate retreat. On the terrace he finds his daughter. "Bundle, is that car of yours in order?" "Yes. Why?" "Then take me up to town in it immediately. I'm going abroad at once. Today." "But, father—" "Don't argue with me, Bundle. George Lomax told me when he arrived this morning that he was anxious to have a few words with me privately on a matter of the utmost delicacy. He added that the King of Timbuktu was arriving in London shortly. I won't go through it again, Bundle. Do you hear? Not for 50 George Lomaxes. If Chimneys is so valuable to the nation, let the nation buy it. Otherwise, I shall sell it to a syndicate, and they can turn it into an hotel." "Where is Codders now?" Bundle is rising to the situation. "At the present minute," replied Lord Caterham, looking at his watch, He is good for at least 15 minutes about the Empire. Another picture. Mr. Bill Eversley, not invited to be present at the graveside ceremony. At the telephone. No, really, I mean it. I say, don't be huffy. Well, you will have supper tonight anyway. No, I haven't. I've been kept to it with my nose at the grindstone. You've no idea what Codders is like. I say, Dolly, you know jolly well what I think about you. You know I've never cared for anyone but you. Yes, I'll come to the show first. How does the old wheeze go? And the little girl tries. Hooks and eyes. Unearthly sounds. Mr. Eversley trying to hum the refrain in question. And now George's peroration draws to a close. The lasting peace and prosperity of the British Empire. I guess, said Mr. Hiram Fish sotto voce to himself and the world at large, that this has been a great little old week.